Hello everybody and welcome. This week I've got something special for you. I'll start with this, a T-bar. I made this quite some years ago. I had a couple of these ends in a toolbox that I bought and didn't know what I was going to do with them. Kept them. This one is a snap-on one. And one day I needed a long breaker bar, so I machined this end down with the grinder just by turning it until this fitted on, and then peened over the end so it wouldn't come off. And this is 60 centimeters long, 2 feet long. Never had any trouble with it, never bent it. It's a solid jack handle. Nice piece of steel. Really strong. Next thing, these things are for the things I've made for my socket set. This one, a little ratchet, which you may have seen in my other in my first video on the toolbox tour. Have a look at that if you'd like. There's more of these sort of things in there. What I actually did was bought a cheap quarter drive, cut the end, cut the handle off, made a new handle that fitted over with a normal joint like that, and then inside I drilled a hole, put a spring and a little ball bearing so that it ratchets that way and that way. So I've got a little flex head quarter drive ratchet. Couldn't buy one at the time, so I made it, and it's one of my mottos: if you can't buy one, make one. Then I made these two palm ratchets, little quarter drive. I've got one here, give you some idea, and all they are is the head of a cheap ratchet, rounded off, cut here and rounded off. And then I turned these up on the lathe and put some notches in them to make them easier to hold when you've got slippery hands. And of course they're reversible because they've got the head in there from the ratchet. I made one for quarter and one for 3/8. This one's reversible like that. Most useful getting in small areas. Next thing, I made this again for getting into small areas. You put a standard socket on the end of that. It's an old 6-inch extension which was twisted, which I cut off, drilled holes in this piece of steel before, after annealing it, fitted them through and then welded them on the back side so they're nice and strong. And now you can get into places. Put a ratchet on one end, on here, socket on the other, and you've got an extra long bar, a little breaker bar. Get into very tight places there because you haven't got the head behind it. Just fits in. Most useful. Some of you will have seen this one last week. It's a chain wrench that I made. This is a 3/8 drive, part of a universal joint, and the rest of it is a bicycle chain which I shortened. Put the original bolt back through that, which fitted through the chain, and that's used for taking off oil filters and the like. Never had one that I couldn't get off with that. And in a similar vein, I made one of these, which is a little strap wrench, and all this is a 6-inch extension, 3/8 extension, with a bolt in the end of it that bolts this strapping or webbing, which is off one of those cheap roof rack straps. And of course that's nice and soft, so if you don't want to damage anything, you put your oil filter in there, and as you tighten it up it gets tighter and turns it off. Again, useful little tool. This one, little tiny T-bar, little tiny one. The handle really is off this. That's the original handle off that. I made the end to fit on the end and then just peened it over. Put a little bolt in the back to hold it so that it didn't twist, and machined the end up with a file and a grinder, and then put a ball in there to retain the socket. Again, useful in small tight areas. What else we got? Oh yes, there's another one of those, which is a brittle one. I've had this for some time. It was very, very bent, and it was usually about this long, but it was so bent it was unusable, because every time you put pressure on it, it moved, the handle twisted round. So what I actually did was shorten it and put a rivet in here so that the head didn't slide off. So now I've got a small, ideal for little places, just the job. Sockets, I've modified a couple of sockets. This one is 2 sockets welded together because I needed a deep socket. This was for an injector for an L200 diesel pickup, and the socket itself would fit on the injector, but it would not clear. I could not put a socket, a ratchet on the end of the socket, because the head of the injector stood through the hole. So I got round it by getting 2 duplicate sockets that I had kicking about and welding them together, and that did the trick. Another one I've got is this one, which is a 11/16 socket welded to a 7/16 socket, both of which were this 7/16 one was cracked on the end, so it was finished, and the 11/16 I got many duplicates of these. It's only a cheap socket, so I welded them together. And the basic principle of this is, on my motorcycle, an 11/16 socket will not fit directly on the plug because of the casting of the head, but this one will, because of the groove here. It allows to pass the casting, which means you can unscrew it. Still difficult to get in, but it does do the job. Next thing, got this little thing here. Had a broken 3-inch extension, and I needed a 1/2-inch crow's foot, which I didn't have at the time. In fact, I don't think they were available where I lived at the time. But I needed something of that ilk to get a turbo out of a 2.8 Sierra, and this was the only thing I could come up with. This extension had been broken at the end, so I welded it to a 1/2-inch spanner, and that allowed me to get in the difficult area and get the 1/2-inch nut out. I believe it was a 13mm, but I modified this so it would fit on a 13. Next, got a little socket here, again an old 10mm socket which was cracked, and I had a nut driver that the handle had snapped off, so I welded the nut driver into the 10mm socket there, which gives me 1/2-inch to 1/4. Don't use it very often, but it is handy and it does get you out of trouble. And not only that, you can use it as a little screwdriver. If you need a bit of extra torque, you just clip it to something like that. Next thing, another one of my little ratchets that bit the dust. I used the handle out of, drilled a hole in the end, and mounted a bit driver. Tapped it in so it is tight, doesn't come out. Magnetic in the end, so it does hold the bits. Handy little tiny driver. These sockets, I've got a 10mm socket here, and what I did was, out of the DVD drives that you get, or CD drives that you get for PCs. They have little square magnets in them, very, very strong rare earth magnets. What I did was I glued with epoxy, glued the magnets inside, so you can use them as drivers and clip in. That actually fits really nicely, the 3X drive. I think these are 10mm drive anyway. And I made 3 different sizes, because there's one for the impact driver, which is slightly smaller than that, and they fit into that one, and that's an 8mm. That fits rather nicely in there. Again, a little tiny magnet in there, really strong magnet. And then on the other end of the scale I got one of these, which is the 7mm, and that holds the small bits, again with a magnet inside, so it can't drop out. And I've had quite a lot of use out of these, really, really good. And also there's a standard driver which I've driven into a 6mm, and a spare 5/16 one, which I think is the same as the 8mm. And that's that for the little thing, the little magnetic. And of course the holder, made on the 3D printer, designed it and printed it out on the printer. Ideal. Jobbed. Next thing, a T-bar driver. Didn't have one, so I bought one of these ends in the Chinese shop that holds these bits, standard driver bits, holds them in place. Welded that to a rod, ground it down, made the other end so that you got like a little T-bar. Most useful again, used it quite a bit. Next thing, T-bar from again another Chinese shop T-bar. Got one here which was the 10mm. I bought 2 10mm, and again a broken extension. I ground down the end until it was the correct size to fit in the 10mm socket, slightly larger, and then tapped it in so that it's a solid fit. So now I've got a T-bar for the quarter drive. I already got I've got a proper one for the 1/2" drive, but I was lacking a 3/8 drive one and I couldn't find one anywhere, so made that one up. And yeah, we've seen that one. Needed a long bit driver, again cheap screwdriver from the Chinese shop. I think they were £1 for about 3 of them. Bought it just to make the end into a driver. Again, same idea, ground the end down, drifted the end off one of the bit drivers there, and drifted this back onto here. So now I've got a bit driver for that, which holds just about any screw, nice and long if you need to get in somewhere awkward and you don't have a long extension, long enough extension. Handy to have. Again, another little extension there. I've made it from quarter drive to take bits. Just a useful piece of kit to have in the box. Little socket and a driver with a piece of an Allen key in the middle. Right. And this one, I made this up years ago, can't quite remember what it was for, but I know it was an Allen key that I didn't have and I needed extra leverage on. So what I did was weld this onto an old socket, an old bolt, so that it would fit in the Allen key, in the Allen hole, and then put an extension in the back here to give me the leverage that I needed. Worked and did the job. Couple of things I made on a 3D printer. and that was these things. Handy again for getting into really tight areas. If you want to spin a 3/8, you can spin that like that with your fingertips. Again, for nuts and bolts that won't quite come out. There's been so many instances where it will turn just a quarter of a turn and then it'll stop and it gets tight again, and you've got to get a spanner or a ratchet in there. With these, you just put them on and you can turn fairly stiff nuts with those and bolts. So I made one for the 3/8 and the 1/2 inch drive, and I made this which fits over, when you've got a ratchet, it fits over that for the ratchet, and then you can turn the ratchet or hold the ratchet as you're using it. So I keep those in the box just in case. Next thing I've got, I made this one afternoon because I've always seen people do the 2 spanner trick, where you've got a spanner or a wrench and you put another spanner on it. Let me get another spanner. Yeah, they do the 2 spanner trick where you put the spanner inside and then you got extra leverage. And yeah, I thought, well, wouldn't it be better if you had a tool just for that? So I made this up, and what that actually does is hooks into the tool like that. And just a piece of steel and a couple of rivets. And then next thing, little light. I needed a little light, a directional light. So I found this in the Chinese shop, a really cheap little light which was on a pedestal. And I thought, well, I need one that's battery powered, and I wanted a magnet so that I could put it on things and not have a problem. So I could put it on, angle it, and have that little light. And it's just the job. It's an old torch which I've glued a magnet on one end, grabbed the wires out of it, fed them into this thing to power the little LED light and the buttons on the top, and it sticks quite well. This I made absolutely years ago, and it's an old selector shaft out of a gearbox, and I needed a specific size square to take out a drain plug. So I actually ground the end square so that I had a spanner to take off the drain plug. Useful little tool, used it as a punch as well. Next thing, I needed a little hammer one day, so I made this little hammer. It's an old chisel that I had, a really old one which was battered and beaten, and I cut it off with the angle grinder, drilled a hole in it, sharpened it back up and put it on a little handle. Because it's chisel, I can hold it and hit it with a hammer without fear of shards of steel coming off and blinding you, because you know about knocking 2 hammers together. Well, this one you can, because it's part of a chisel, and you can whack that end with another hammer, and you can put your hands out of the way while you're hammering and chiseling things. That's what I've used it mainly for. I have got, again, one of those cheap screwdrivers, remember this one? And I needed a trim tool. The way I made this was, you know these spanners you get with various pieces of equipment, and then you never know what they're for afterwards. I got one of these and cut it off, and then just welded it on the back to the end of an old screwdriver which I cut off. This has been most useful getting trim panels off, because it's wide enough to go past the trim clips, which are normally about that big, and you can get it in there and actually pull it either side without breaking the trim clip. I went and bought some cheap screwdrivers, cheap as chips, because I needed picks and various other things. And I started off making a small pick, and then a bent pick, and a hooked pick, and like a little shoehorn type thing, which I found useful for getting out seals and things like that. And again, slightly larger bent 90-degree pick, all cheap screwdrivers. Again, flattened this, heated it up, beat it out. Again, useful for little lever bars. This is for the really small trim clips when you want to get the centers out. This one, a little bit of tool steel welded on to the handle, and I've sharpened it up to make a scraper. Really nice little scraper, and you've got something to put your palm against when you're using it, so you don't get blisters. Again, another trim tool that I needed, and sharpened up the edges so it will actually fit behind the trim without damaging it. Slightly wider scraper, again sharpened up, and you can sharpen these so that this one is razor sharp, and ideal for scraping gaskets. And another trim tool, again cheap screwdriver, and I think this was a little spanner as well, but one of those little cheap ones. Right, there's that. Needed this one day for clamping a brake pipe. Couldn't get one in my local store, so I thought, right, I need one, I will make one. Always before I've used like a long-nosed vice grip with a bit of tube over it, and I thought, well, I need something I can leave in place overnight or something. So I made this up. Just put the tube in there, that clips over, and then you tighten up, clamps the tube. Nickel plated it as well so it wouldn't rust. Something some people will laugh at. Didn't have one at the time. This is a Mark 1. This is a valve spring compressor that I made. There's a bonnet hinge out of an old Ford Capri, I think it was. And I just welded this up, welded this thing on the end here so that it would hold the valve, and then when you close it up it locks up so that it will not open again. So I was quite happy with that. So I made a Mark II version. This one's much better because I can take this end out here and change this end. I coated this with nickel plated it when I'd finished it. It has been made for many years now, and is starting to just tarnish on a few of the edges. You've seen those little helping hands. Well, what I've actually done here is I've got the old metal raw plugs, forced the crocodile clips into the metal raw plugs, and then glued one of those very strong magnets on the end, so you can clip them to car bodywork and they'll hold your wires while you're soldering. I made 2 of them and I mounted them on this little bit of, well, I believe that's a bit of a spanner as well. I think that concludes this week. Next week I've got a project coming. I hope you found this interesting, because I'll give you some inspiration on what you can do when you need to do it. If you'd like this, please like and subscribe for more. There'll be more coming. I have got, like I said, a project coming up, which I'll tell you about in a moment. You'll have to excuse the shaky camera work because I'm now outside, and this is going to be the start of a project. It's been sitting here since the year dot, and there's quite a lot to do on it. There's brakes to do, and other bits and pieces that need doing, and the carburetor hasn't been running for a long time, so this is going to be the start of a project next week. If you're interested in seeing more of this, please let me know in the comments. And there will be some paint work going on with this, and some wiring and some other bits and pieces, some upholstery work and some engine work as well. This is next week's project, or the start of project. Give you a good look around it next week. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next week. Oh, please like and subscribe if you like this. I think I've said that already. If not, do so anyway. Hit that little bell notification, and thank you very much again, and I'll see you next week. Bye now.